All right. So without further ado, Stephen Hughes. In his presentation, Dr. Hughes does a great job of telling you about who he is, and so my introduction will be brief. I first heard Steve Hughes speak in Atlanta about 3 or 4 years ago, right? Three years ago? And he was speaking at a Montessori conference, and I remember thinking, who is this guy? He's really smart. Then I started to see him more and more. I saw him at subsequent conferences. I started reading publications about him in publications. On the web, I read stories about his speaking engagement in other parts of the world. But this past summer, I got to work alongside him as a colleague at the Montessori Administrators Retreat. So now, I'm very honored to introduce my friend, Dr. Steve Hughes.
Well, thanks, Mara. My friend Mara, thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for coming, and thank Mara and the board for making this night happen. I am so happy to be here. I got the chance to visit Montessori in Redlands, it was last spring, sometime in May, yeah. And I thought, man, this is how it ought to be. This is how it ought to be. And here it is, and here you are. So, I have a slideshow for you tonight, and if you can't see the screen, it won't be as much fun. I think we heard there may be some seats available toward the front of the room. We have a couple over here, we have some right there and some right here. And again, it's a slideshow. You really don't need to see me, and in fact, we're going to turn the lights down now in a moment. And I want you to see the screen. So, my name is Steve. I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist, and that kind of informs my view of Montessori education, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I'll tell you about how I got connected to Montessori tonight. I just want to say thank you all for coming here. I'm going to talk for a little longer than these sorts of talks tend to go. Usually you've got 45 minutes, then off to the party. I'm going to go a little bit past an hour, and I'm sorry for that, but I've been told many times that it's okay because, well, frankly, I've been told this is kind of an interesting talk. So hopefully we'll maintain that streak and that you'll also find this interesting. And if you have to leave during the talk for some reason, go ahead. I don't object to that. I know that people have kids and people have lives, so. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I promise you that it's going to be worth showing up and hopefully worth sticking around as well. So I mentioned I'm a neuropsychologist, and rarely do I get the opportunity to explain to people what it is to be a neuropsychologist. It usually happens that my wife and I are at a dinner party, and I've managed to steer the conversation my way finally. And I say, well, you know, as it happens, I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist. And it's at that moment that people have to go and get another drink or the hors d'oeuvre plate is empty. I will, however, avail myself of the opportunity to tell you about my profession while you're all here as something of a captive audience. So people with my profession typically have a background as a clinical psychologist or something like that. And indeed, I have a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Minnesota Graduate School. But I have additional postdoctoral training that really is about the assessment of brain functioning. And in my particular aspect of the field, I specialize in the measurement of children's brains, how well children's brains are functioning. In a medical school setting, which is where I've done most of my work, I see children who have medical or emotional or behavioral or developmental problems that somehow impact brain development, learning, cognitive functioning, or behavior. That really is the role of the pediatric neuropsychologist to consult the parents and educators and physicians to help everyone who's involved in basically in helping a child with a medical problem turn out. It's our job to help everyone understand how the medical problem, sometimes the treatment for the medical problem, how that's affected cognition, and maybe how we can help that child have a better outcome. This is immensely rewarding work. Very often, someone like me will hear, the parents during this feedback conference that we'll do after we've done, like maybe 8 hours of testing and lots more sort of integration and summary of findings. So very often you'll hear parents say, now for the first time I really understand what is going on. And it's also delightful when they say, and I feel like I have hope now. Now I understand, and now I feel I have hope. So it's a very rewarding work. And it's very rewarding to work for the well-being of children. In my own research, I've studied how attention develops, the effects of poverty and lead exposure on child development. And most recently, I've begun some work looking at the beneficial effects of Montessori education. I also have a private practice in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'd love to see your kid. although I could refer you to people here in your part of the world who could also help you understand what's going on with your child. So that's some of my background. In some sense, this kind of informs my interest in Montessori education. We'll get to that in just a moment. Before I do that, though, I want to share a question with you. And that question is this: what should school be for? Now, we all went to school. We're in a school. Our children are at this school or a school nearby. What should school be for? We've probably all thought about that question as we have been in school, as we've made decisions about where our children should go to school. I'm going to share some results from a study that actually asked students during their middle school years what they think school should be for. And the way this research was done, it's like a survey, lots and lots of possible goals for education. What do they think are the most important goals for education? And these are the top 10 educational goals that were rated very important by students in this study. And these are lots of words and kind of small, so I'm going to read these to you so you can hear about them in the back. The number one thing that students want is help basically being able to leave school confident, willing, and able to take the initiative in introducing change. That's the number one goal for students. That's what they want school to be for them. They also want help becoming independent and able to stand on their own feet. They want help developing their characters and personalities. They want to hear outside speakers talk about careers and other educational topics. They want to know how to apply the facts and techniques that they learn in school to new problems. They want help ensuring that they can speak well and put what they want to say into words. They want to have discussion lessons where they get practice putting their own point of view forward. They want to learn about different jobs and careers that they can do after they finish with school. They want to be encouraged to have opinions of their own. And they want help understanding the implications and responsibilities of marriage. Who saw that coming? Who saw that one coming? Remarkable. Now, in that same research, they asked teachers, and these were teachers in regular educational environments. These weren't Montessori teachers. And they asked them what they think school should be for. And here are the top 10 educational goals that were rated very important by teachers. And again, it's a lot of words, so I'm going to read it to you. Well, they want to help students develop their characters and personalities. 93% of them rated that as very important. They want to encourage students to be independent and stand on their own feet. 92% rated that as very important. They want to make sure that students are able to read and study on their own. Well, that's a decent academic goal. They want their students to know how to do things. They want to encourage them to have a sense of duty toward their community. They want to ensure that all pupils can speak well and put what they want to say into words easily. They want to encourage their students to have opinions of their own. They want to help them develop a considerate attitude towards other people. They want to help them think about what they want to achieve in life and know how to express themselves in writing and know about right and wrong. It's actually kind of a nice list, isn't it? And you'll notice that it's very similar to the list of things that students think school should be for. I think that's quite remarkable. And you know what? This work has been replicated. And if we did the same thing here, we would come up with a list that's pretty similar, because this is what people want school to be for. Isn't that interesting? We'll talk a little bit more about this later on. And now, I'm going to tell you a story. You all have your story of how you found out about Montessori education. Well, here's my story about how I found out about Montessori education. So those of you who don't have a Montessori background, let me explain. This is the United States. This is a map of our country. And I come from far away. I come from a north central state. I come from Minnesota. Again, those of you who don't have puzzle map experience, that's my state. That's Minnesota. That's where I'm from. And it's no accident that that is green, because Minnesota is a very lush state. We have lots of forests. We also have prairies. We have lots of lakes. In fact, the motto of Minnesota, the state motto, is Land of 10,000 Lakes. And friends, that is an underestimate. We have lots of lakes in Minnesota, and we have lots of beautiful wilderness in Minnesota. Pine forests, that kind of thing. In fact, this part of our state here is a very special area, and it is called the Boundary Waters Canoe Area. I'm curious, who's heard of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area in Minnesota? Unbelievable. If it's a Minnesota audience, everybody's heard of it. And then I would ask, who's been to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area? And everyone, we get a few people here. Everyone in Minnesota has been to, knows somebody. It's a very special part of our state. It's a wilderness preserve, and what's special about it is that There are no motors there. You can't bring a motor to the Boundary Waters canoe area. It's very primitive camping. You get around hiking with backpacks, and you portage your canoes from lake to lake, and you really get back to nature. You know, it's really very primitive. The campsites there are very primitive. Everything you bring in, you have to bring out, you know, that kind of thing. It's a really beautiful place in our state, and it's some place that I think a lot of Minnesotans feel very, very proud to have, and certainly are glad to have access to. And in the Boundary Waters canoe area, this wilderness preserve, there is a YMCA camp, and it's called Camp Widgiewagon. It's a Native American word. I think it means something like fellowship or leadership or something like that. And I learned about Montessori education from a woman who worked at Camp Widgiewagon. This is her. Her name is Deborah Sussex, and she's a friend of my wife's. Now, this will get complicated in a moment. My wife is also named Deborah. This is the other Deborah, okay? This is Deborah's friend, Deborah, okay? And my Deborah and I had just gotten married, and we were having a dinner party. We were doing that thing that you probably did after you got married. It's where we have parties, and we invite people over to the house, and we have dinner, and everybody gets to know each other's friends. You know how that goes, right? So we were having this dinner at our house, talking about how we knew each other, and I met Deborah Sussex, and she told me about what she did for a living. She took people places like this, and on these incredible expeditions, and she brought them back alive. I mean, she was a wilderness expedition leader. She worked for an outfit called the National Outdoor Leadership School, which is kind of like Outward Bound for people who own gear and have money, okay? So she would take people places like that and bring them back alive, places that not everyone came back alive from, you know? So this is really kind of high-end major league adventure, adventure wilderness stuff, and I thought that was remarkable. I mean, I was a postdoc. I was learning how to be a pediatric neuropsychologist. I knew how I got there, but how do you become an expedition leader? You know what I mean? It seems kind of like rarefied occupational status. Well, she got her start working at Camp Widgiewagon, she explained. In fact, she helped develop some of the youth environmental education programming that they do there. She did that like right out of college. And she explained that at Camp Widgiewagon, she worked with groups of young people and groups of young people that came from all over the state of Minnesota. And that my ears sort of perked up at that. Wow, she has seen young people from all over the state of Minnesota. What an interesting cross-section she must have seen in that work. And so I asked her what I thought was kind of an obvious question. Well, you've seen kids from everywhere in Minnesota. Where do the good kids come from? I'm kind of curious, is it city kids, is it country kids, is it suburban kids, or is it kids way outstate, kids from the Twin Cities? And to her credit, she's not a very judgmental person. She's a really neat person. And she said, oh, well, let me think about that. Because she's not thinking in those terms normally. But when asked, when compelled to come up with where the good kids come from, she thought about it and she said, I guess they come from Lake Country Montessori School in South Minneapolis. And I said, why is that? And she said, well, this is adolescent programming. Adolescents have this herd instinct. They've got new bodies and new emotions. Sometimes they have their own way of doing things. And the adolescent brain is really busy. They're preoccupied with things, and everybody has to pitch in and help out at Camp Widgiewagon. And with most of these adolescents, she says, the staff would have to ask them to do something, and then you have to kind of hassle them, and then you have to kind of remind them, and then you have to hold them accountable. And then they would sort of do their assigned chores, sometimes a bit grudgingly. But she said there was something different about the kids from the Montessori school. She said you'd ask them to do something, and then they would do it. And they would do it well. And then they would embellish it. Well, she didn't say that, but what she told me was they would wipe down the tables in the dining hall. They'd sweep the floors in the dining hall. And she gave the example of then they found a way to put a vase of flowers on every table. Now, isn't that something? Adolescents making an environment beautiful for other adolescents. Wow. And then she said, the kids from the Montessori school, they seem to have the ability to look around, figure out what needs to be done, and do it. And then she said, They're good at doing things. Well, that struck me. And I thought, good at doing things. How do adolescents get to be good at doing things? I had been at the Boy Scout car wash earlier in the week, and I watched 12 adolescent boys stand around holding wet sponges while their dads washed my car. And I thought about my own adolescence. And you know, I was a lot more like the Boy Scouts holding the wet sponges than I was like the kids putting vases of flowers on every table in the dining hall. So there was something about that encounter, that conversation. I sort of said, remember this. Because this could be important. And so nature took its course, and about 2 years after that dinner party, my wife, my Deborah, and I had Isabel. So because of that chance encounter, because of that woman made it to that dinner party, we got connected to something that has been unbelievably important to us. That's the reason I'm here tonight, because that dinner party happened about 14 years ago, 15 years ago. And because of that dinner party, Isabel found her way to a Montessori environment. And we all fell in love with what she experienced there. You know, maybe you remember how this was when you were looking for a school, a preschool that would be almost as good as staying home with mom or dad, you know? We had that, you know, we were looking for a place that would be almost as good as staying home with mom and dad. We went to a kind of a home-based preschool environment and then fled, you know. We went to a center-based preschool environment and noticed how sticky all the plastic toys were and fled. And then we walked into a Montessori program. And we had been looking for a place that would be almost as good as keeping her home with mom or dad. And in about 5 minutes, we looked at each other, and almost as one, we said, take the child. So that was a long time ago, and Isabel's grown up in a Montessori environment. She now attends Hershey Montessori Farm School in Ohio, in Huntsburg, Ohio. And you may have noticed that we live in Minnesota, so my daughter, who's almost 13, lives in another state and is a boarder at a school that is a 2.5-day drive from our house. Who in the world would do that? The only reason we would do it is we've been there, we've met children who've been there, and we want some of that for our kid. So Isabel has turned out spectacularly. Here we are in Sydney. This is Deborah and Isabel, just not too long ago, and you know, we've just marveled at the experience of our girl turning into this mature and wise and funny and self-possessed but not selfish young woman. We really couldn't be any happier with how she's turned out. We all really fell in love with Montessori education in our house, and we're simply delighted with what that's done for our daughter, at least for the most part. But you know, I was not the only pediatric neuropsychologist in my group at the University of Minnesota Medical School who had an experience like this. In fact, you know, we're kind of a mixed age faculty. Some are older, some are younger, and you know, some of us are sort of, you know, of child having years, and of those of us of the younger faculty, those of us who have children, 75% of the children of the younger faculty have at one point or another been in a Montessori program. It's not just me, you know. Here's what one of them said, in fact. My colleague Fiona said, Montessori education is the embodiment of all I learned while studying for a PhD in child development. That's quite a statement. I mean, studying for a PhD, you learn not to say stuff like that, you know, because that's quite a statement. Another colleague of mine had been to a Montessori school to do an observation on a child that she was doing an evaluation, you know, kind of observing the child in their school environment to help understand what was going on with him. And so, you know, this is fun. It's fun. Get off site, go visit a school, come back, you know. And I asked my friend, my colleague Terry, well, you know, how was that? How was that school? And she said, oh, that's where my kid's going to school. I mean, she spent 45 minutes there, and she'd observed the child, but she'd also observed the school and realized that what was happening there was gold, and she wanted some of that for her kid. I myself have said it's like education designed by a gifted pediatric neuropsychologist. and my colleague Fiona, the first one that I quoted, actually I have to include her a second time because one day at lunch we were talking about our children's respective experiences and their Montessori programs, and she said, you know, it's like education designed by a gifted developmental psychologist. And that's what her background is. So what is it about this experience that people like me, people in the brain business, when we get exposure to a good Montessori program, you know, get all sort of like worked up about it, you know? What is it about? Well, of course, this is what we're about. We're about the brain. And our experience of Montessori education is that this is the most profound, most perfect example of brain-based developmental learning that there can be, at least so far. So let's talk about brains. Let's talk about brains. Most of you have seen an image like this at one point or another. You know, the brains look pretty much the same from brain to brain. There can be some variation in some aspects of shape or size in different regions, but on the whole, they all look pretty much the same. And this is what brains do. This is an animation showing brain development in children age 4 to young adults age 21. This is actually averaged across many brains from age 4 to age 21, and this is what brains do. They develop. Now what you see here is this false color image. This is the maturation of the cortex. This is brain tissue that's becoming mature and able to function. And so you notice at age 4, you know, there's not a lot of, you know, really mature brain tissue, but as the child develops, it matures and that becomes more functional. And you know, this is why children who are young are unsteady and have, you know, more trouble figuring things out because they just have less online. Now there's also something important as you look at this image. I want you to remember something. And if you remember nothing else from this talk tonight, remember this. You know, you can pretty much, a human body will grow if you feed it. You know, that's sort of really all you need to do. Feed it and it will grow. And to some extent, the brain will mature if all you do is feed it. But there's a real limit to how much it will mature. And in order for that brain to mature, for language to develop, for reasoning skills, for movement, the capacity to control the body, for all these things to develop, that brain needs to be able to do this thing, and I want you to remember that. It needs to be able to engage in experimental interactions with the environment. This is essential for human brain development. There needs to be the opportunity to engage and explore with the world. And you know, we know from, unfortunately, some sort of horrific historic examples that if a child is like constrained in some way by some mentally ill, you know, adult, what'll happen is their brains won't develop well, and they'll not develop the capacity for language unless they get to experience language. They won't develop the capacity for higher reasoning unless they have things to reason about. Our brains need to engage in experimental interactions with the environment in order to become fully mature. Let's talk some more about brains. I want now to draw your attention to areas B and C here. B and C. These are the motor and sensory strips. You actually have a little map of your body on the surface of your brain in these two areas. Let's look at a different view. This is kind of looking at it on edge on now, right? Like you've sliced a loaf of bread. And your body is actually mapped on the surface of the brain, not once but twice. Twice on each hemisphere, and one is sensory. So that means that when you feel a sensation on your body, it's actually being activated in that part of the brain. And the other strip has to do with movement. So when you move your body, you're actually generating movement by activating that particular part of the brain. And you can see the body's mapped on the brain. And look at it. This is very interesting. The brain is like two boxing gloves that are kind of, you know, touching each other. So from the inside surface, it rolls around to the outside. That's what we're looking at here. And you can see on the inside surface, that's where the foot is sort of mapped, and then it rolls along to shin. And you notice that there's a lot of footness there, isn't there? Not very much shinness. I mean, you notice it when you bump your shin. But if you notice that, it's almost hard to tell just where you bump your shin. There's not a lot of resolution. You know what I'm saying? Okay. So keep rolling along there. You see, there's the torso, there's the arm, and hey, there's quite a lot devoted to the hand, quite disproportionate to the size of our hand, isn't it? Then you roll further and you get to the face and the lips, and actually here you see the neurological reason for why necking feels so good. Because there's an awful lot of geography dedicated to those lips, very sensitive part of the body. If you were to actually take the map on your brain of your body and make a body out of it, this is what you get. Pretty wild, isn't it? Yet, arguably, this is a better representation of you than the version of you that you see in the mirror in the morning, because this is you from the perspective of your brain. And according to your brain, what are you all about? You are all about hands. You are all about hands. And you know, when you see it in this way, suddenly it makes sense that humans are kind of about exploring the world with their hands. And of course, especially young humans who don't yet have language development, okay? So what does a baby do? They pick things up, they hold them, they manipulate them, they touch it with their mouth, they put it in their mouth, because this is where all the information input is coming from. Human beings are really about hands. In fact, the hands are these information pipelines to the brain. Maria Montessori said that the hands are the prehensile organs of the mind. So why do young children whose capacity to understand language is still developing, why do they spend so much time sitting and listening to teachers telling them how the world works? What if there was an educational approach that allowed children to engage the way their brain is built with materials in the world and use that as a way to discover how the world works? And of course, that's what Montessori education is all about. Wouldn't it be a good idea to design education around how the brain is built? And that's what Montessori did. So I'll talk about some more brain-related things, and I want to talk about a way that I like to think about the brain, and that maybe I'm inviting you to as well. I want to tell you now about nuggets and networks. There are many functions in the brain that develop into these rather specific little areas that act as what you might call neurological nuggets, little processors. And these areas, of course, don't function in isolation. They have to communicate with other parts of the brain, and they do that through networks, through sort of, fibers that connect into that share information. Brains need healthy nuggets and healthy networks to function well. So let's talk a little bit about nuggets. Now, reading is a wonderfully nuggetized function. We now know, research has been along for a long time, that says that these are the things that a brain needs to do in order to read. It's got to apprehend these arbitrary symbols that we call letters. It's got to sound them out into words. It's got to match the word through general experience with some object in the environment. So when we say cat, that's cat, that is a cat, that we have to match these things up. And there are different parts of the brain that are necessary for every one of these functions. These are kind of little nuggets that have to work in cooperation with each other for us to read. And you can see in the top picture here, the top is a normal reading brain. You can see there's this patterns of nuggetized activation while that brain is reading. And in the lower brain here, this is a brain that has dyslexia, and you can see that there's a much reduced pattern of nuggetized activation. It's quite interesting. You can take a brain that is having trouble sort of coalescing or building those little reading nuggets, and you can do an intensive reading intervention that will actually build a nugget. It's not the exact same nugget, but the point is you can nuggetize phonological processing in a brain by doing a lot of sort of intensive practice at it. And in fact, many of the materials that will be used for that are very similar, if not identical, to the materials that are used to teach reading in the Montessori environment. Isn't that interesting? And in fact, Montessori's reading curriculum sort of rings every bell, every one of these reading nuggets, every one of these functions that the brain has to do in order to read. Hey, there's aspects of the Montessori curriculum that are actually around strengthening every one of those little processors. So letter word recognition, phonological processing, language comprehension. There's aspects to the Montessori reading curriculum that address every one of these functions. How did she know? How did she know to ring those three bells? Now we see it with imaging, but she knew about this over 100 years ago. So here you see nature's most perfect child working to learn to recognize the symbol that makes the D sound. And of course, she's using the sandpaper letters. She traces the shape with a gross motor movement. She can feel the roughness, and she knows when she slid off the letter. And she says to herself as she's tracing that, as it becomes a unique shape, she says, D. And she's repeating it to herself, D. She's forming that sound-symbol relationship. She's forming a direct sound-symbol relationship. Now, why in the world would anybody teach her that's a D? Because that is not the sound-symbol relationship that she needs to read. She needs to know that that sound is the D. And this is not that hard to figure out. Why in the world would anybody teach children letter names first? Because all that's going to do is interfere with their capacity to learn sound-symbol relationships, which is how you crack the code, which is how you read phonetically. So there's Isabel learning duh, and here's Isabel repeating those gross motor movements with a pencil and paper. And I want to direct now, if I may, I want to direct your attention to that extraordinary, very mature pencil grasp that my daughter is demonstrating. If we were doing a developmental assessment using the Bailey or the Mullen, these are two kind of developmental tests that are widely used, that would be a full credit 2-point pencil grasp. And I wish I could claim some credit for it, but I actually can't. Because your teacher really can't claim credit for it either, because she developed that sophisticated, mature pencil grasp when she was doing something entirely unrelated, when she was doing cylinder work. Because in the sensorial work, the cylinder sensorial material, it's about learning about sequencing and large to small and wide to narrow and short to tall. But while the child is doing that kind of puzzle work with the rods, they're actually maneuvering those rods by holding on to the little knobby on the top of the rod. And they've been shown how to hold that knobby using a rather interesting pencil-like grasp. And in fact, the knob is the exact diameter of a pencil, because while the direct purpose of the cylinder blocks is to learn to sequence and apprehend these aspects of volume, the indirect purpose is to help prepare the hand to hold a pencil. Oh my God. When I learned that, it was like, oh, how can that be? And of course, the curriculum is full of this stuff. Virtually everything that they're working with has a direct purpose and also has an indirect purpose that is getting them ready to do something. You know, the cylinder work, the cylinder blocks, this is like 2 years before pencil work happens. So think about that. 2 years before we're going to start using a pencil to write letters, we're beginning to prepare the hand. There's other work that's done preparatory as well, to give strength to the wrist, to give mobility and strength to the muscles of the hand, because it's going to need those. The hand is going to need those muscles when it gets ready to start writing. And so we're beginning to prepare the hand for writing 2 years in advance. And of course, we're also, we've got a phonological processor online now because we've been using the sandpaper letters and the sand tray. And so I went to the store, Sam has a dog, this child is not yet 5. And they've got a fully functioning phonological processor. So they can encode, they can take those letters, they know what they want to say, and this child is telling us something about their day. I went to the store, my mom came too, we got milk and eggs. Hey, here's an expository essay, in the, this is a 4.5-year-old version of an expository essay, right? They're telling us stuff about their day. So, there's some of that sound symbol stuff, and here's some other material here. Many of you are familiar with these. The bottom ones, there's a picture of an object, and then there's the name of the object, and so they're doing what I would consider vocabulary development, learning how to match words with pictures that represent those words. But you know what? There's something else that's going on here, too, that when I noticed this, it was another one of those, oh my God, kind of moments, because these are not just pictures and words, because you can see it, probably you can't read it, but above those, there's 2 little cards that say plant and animal. And so while that child is matching the names of plants with pictures of plants and the names of animals with the picture of animals, they're learning something else, and that is that we organize objects in the world into categories. And so in my little neuropsychologist brain, what I see is one strand that suddenly becomes 2, because we're building cognitive complexity in a child who is 4, maybe 4.5, maybe even younger than that when they get to this material. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So now let's talk a little bit about networks. So we've used the reading as a kind of a nugget example. So most of us have seen a picture like this, and through the miracle of diffusion tensor imaging, we can actually see the axons, the bundles of connective fibers that associate parts of the brain to each other, and also go through descend through the spinal cord and upward through the sensory system. And this is a lovely picture of that neurological network. Now there's something else that I want you to remember, and that is this. A well-developed neurological network gives your child access to more neurons, to more problem-solving resources when it's confronted with some new puzzle to solve, some new problem-solving activity. It's really important that your child have a well-developed neurological network, and the only way that develops is through this, opportunities to engage in experimental interactions with the environment. This is so essential. This is how those nuggets will communicate with each other. This is how the child will gain access to broader and more sort of cognitive resources when confronted by a novel problem. In fact, I'm going to confront you with a novel problem right now. This is an example of what I'm sure for most of you is something new and probably a little bit difficult. It's an item from a nonverbal intelligence test. And here's how this works. Look at the top row on the above object. Okay, so this becomes this, and then becomes this, and in the same way, this becomes this, becomes this, and using the same rule or rules, this one becomes, well, which one of these down below? So I'd like you to take a moment and see if you can figure it out. And what's happening, and I'll keep talking so I'll make it hard for you to figure it out, but while you're trying to figure it out, your brain is trying out different approaches. Maybe it's going to say, well, maybe I'll just see what completes the pattern most sensibly. Or I know there's kind of an empty to half to full thing going on here. It looks like it kind of becomes two versions of empty, half full. And empty, half full. Okay, so which one is it down there below? And while your brain is trying to figure this out, we know what's going on because we've actually, not we, but someone has actually done brain imaging while people are trying to figure out these sorts of problems. And this is what's going on. It's new, it's difficult. The brain draws upon all available neurons to try to make sense of the puzzle. This is a brain image of a person doing exactly that sort of puzzle. We got front, back, side to side. We have a lot of visual processing going on as a visual task, but there's generalized activation throughout the brain because it's calling upon all available resources, recruiting more neurons to try to figure out this novel task, this new puzzle. How well you can solve new puzzles depends in part on how well developed your neurological network is. Now here's another novel task for many of us, at least back in the 80s. This is the computer game Tetris. Is everybody familiar with Tetris? Okay. And so it's action-packed, it's fast, and stuff is falling out of the sky. And this is what a brain that has never played Tetris before looks like the first time it plays Tetris. Wow. Really lit up, isn't it? Generalized activation. Every available neuron being recruited to help figure out how to rotate that thing and make the little blocks go and have it continue. If your brain has healthy, well-developed networks, it can get more neurons to coordinate problem solving and help. Now, if you can believe it, here is an actual learning curve for Tetris. Okay? Beginning Tetris players you see down here can solve about 10, can get about 10 of them sorted before the game's over. And over a period of time, by the time they've been practicing for about 45 days, a brain gets pretty good at Tetris, and it can solve like about 100 or more. You can get 100 or more done. And over that period of time, the activation goes from this to this. Now what's happened here is this brain has gotten good at playing Tetris. In fact, if this was you back in college, this brain can now, well, it can play Tetris on the video game there on the campus bar, it can drink a beer, it can eat a hamburger, possibly it can try to impress some other brain with how good it is at playing Tetris, okay? There's resources freed up, and in fact, really what's activated here is a little visual processing, and there is the right hand maneuvering the joystick. Because that's about all that's going on, because it knows how to do it. It's got mastery over Tetris. So now it knows how to do that, and now it can figure out something else. This is what mastery looks like. This is, there was a similar process moving from something that looked like this to something that looked like this the first time you sat on a tricycle. Because it wasn't obvious how to do that, was it? I mean, it's forward and backward, oh, I got to coordinate this. And then came steering, right? But your brain got good at it, just like your children's brains got good at it. And then this is you on a two-wheeler, right? It was like this, okay? And then you developed mastery, and then it was like that. And probably you can remember what it was like to sit behind the wheel of a car for the first time. And there was a lot of this going on. Generalized cortical activation, because your brain doesn't know how to drive a car yet. But with practice, and now you get to work and you almost don't even know how you got there because you've been talking on the phone or listening to the radio, possibly texting somebody. So this is the process of learning and mastery. And I want to revisit that question now that I started with. What should school be for? I'll tell you my answer. I think school should be about helping that process occur to an optimal degree for every child. Every child should have the opportunity to have their brain developed to the fullest extent that it's capable of. I believe that school should be about helping new brains form good nuggets and networks. School should be about building better brains, helping them go from this to that. Time and again, as they develop mastery over new things, as we refine that network, as we train those nuggets, as we build a brain that is ready to confront life. So we know some things about how to do that. We know that, for example, when we allow children the opportunity for repetition, they can kind of lock in this thing. Remember how many days of playing Tetris to develop mastery over Tetris? It was like, 55 days, okay? So one of the things that we get in these Montessori environments is we get opportunities for endless repetition, because that's how brains develop mastery. So here's Isabel completing the pink tower. In fact, her teacher was there. This was the day she got it. And what did she do after she got it? She did it again. She did it again. She did it again, because she was locking in mastery, okay? Here's a boy at Sitting Bull School in Little Eagle, South Dakota. And look at the same thing. Look at the concentration. All those neurons coming online, coordinating effort, developing mastery over the task. And of course, the Montessori environment is full of these things, isn't it? Every set of materials presented at a moment of developmental opportunity, when the brain is ready to take on a puzzle like this. Repeated, practiced, studied, experimented with to the point of mastery, at which point that child's brain is given a new puzzle by an attentive teacher who understands that now they're ready for something that's a little more abstract. A set of materials that continues down this path from the most concrete to the most abstract, always presented when the brain is ready, always giving it an opportunity to practice and develop mastery. We also know that environments that are secure also help build better brains. It's not just physical trauma that can affect learning. Emotional trauma affects learning. We would see children who have had head injuries. It happens, right? And they lose learning. And if they lose learning because the trauma to the brain sort of blows out recent learning. That's why a lot of times people don't remember the car accident. They gain consciousness or they gain memory sometime after the accident, and they feel like, ooh, I lost 2 hours of my life. The trauma to the brain blows out recent learning. It doesn't become encoded, okay? And emotional trauma does the same thing as well. Well, here's a spot that was in my daughter's preschool environment, in her children's house. And then when I first saw this, I remember thinking, geez, somebody spends a lot of time making things pretty around here, As if that was like a nice thing, oh, what a bonus, right? And of course, I really come to understand that beauty is not a bonus. Beauty is essential. If we're about building better brains, if we want to allow every child to gain optimal cognitive development, they need to be environments that are peaceful and beautiful and allow them moments like this. Because that's when the brain is doing some of its most important work, during moments of peace. Remember when you were a kid and you got to clap the erasers outside because you were a good student that day or something like that? You got to do that as a reward? He gets to water the plants, and it's not a reward. He's been doing something a little more cognitively intensive. He's probably put his material away now. He's going to stretch his legs, because that's good for a person after they've done some intensive cognitive work. And he's going to notice the plants are dry. He's going to get the watering pail, and he's going to water the plants. He's going to care for living things in his environment, not as a reward. This is a part of growing up as a human being, learning to care for things in the environment. Here's Lillian. It's Lillian's birthday this day. There she is, carrying the earth around a candle, which of course mirrors her own journey around the sun. What a remarkable way to teach children about a year, and to help them understand that the sun is the source of light and warmth that feeds our planet. What a wonderful way to have that learning. And of course, it's Lillian's special day, but all these other children know that when it's their turn, they're going to have this experience too. I remember the only day Isabel, let's see, what do I want to say? Isabel loved her birthday because she got to have this experience, but only slightly less did she love any other kid's birthday. And there's something very beautiful about how birthdays worked at Isabel's school. It was that kid's day, and there was no selfishness around that kid. It wasn't like, haha, my day. There was a kind of a generosity of spirit, both in the child whose birthday it was, and in everybody else who got to enjoy that experience with them. There's something I'm still trying to find the words for, and maybe you can remember seeing this with your child. Remember when you were a kid and it was your birthday, and there was a mixture of kind of excitement and also kind of hope? You know, like, I hope there's presents, you know, hope things go well, you know, almost a nervousness. Maybe I'm saying too much, okay? But do you remember that kind of almost an uncertain feeling? I thought there was something really remarkable. When it was Isabel's birthday, there was none of that. There was none of it. She owned it. And she owned it in a way that was so beautifully unselfish. And I saw that in her friends too. When it was their day, they knew it was their day. And there was nothing selfish about how they owned it. They let it happen to them. What a remarkable thing. What a remarkable thing for them. You know, we also know that hands-on learning, good Lord, we've made that case, I think, haven't we? You know, here's Mia, she's beginning her work, she's learning that tasks have a beginning part, a doing part, and a completion part. You know, kind of like life for you at work, isn't it? There is a beginning, a doing, and a completion, and the work isn't actually done until the report's in your vice president or manager's inbox, right? There is actually a completing phase. So she's going to roll this out, do some work, and then she's going to clean up and put it away. These girls are making a snack for their friends, and of course it's really not about the snack, is it? They are learning the steps necessary to prepare and serve a snack. They're making progress towards their goal. They're thinking about their next move. They're persisting at the task, and they're doing this work independently. They're learning to solve problems on their own. You know, problems like, for example, that knife is actually upside down. She's cutting with the dull side, okay? And you know, it wouldn't be like us. Wouldn't it be like us to want to swoop in there and say, oh, honey, you know, it cuts better if you use the sharp side. Let me show you. We would do that because we're helpful. But you know, in a Montessori environment, no one would do that to the child because she could actually figure this out. And if we let her have the aha, it's going to lock it in a little bit more. Okay? She'll have had the discovery. She'll have figured it out. You know, think about your life. Is it not true that all meaningful learning takes place through analysis of error? Is that not what your experience has been? All meaningful learning takes place through analysis of error. And every set of materials in a Montessori environment allows a child to figure out for themselves if they've got it right. Think about the rods, the cylinder block, the cylinders, okay? I mean, you know when it's not right because you got one piece left over that doesn't fit, okay? And everything is like that. The capacity to check their own work and experiment and see if they got it right is there for the child in all of the materials. All meaningful learning takes place through analysis of error, and that's what they're doing all the time in these environments. We also know that we can build better brains through multisensory engagement. Here's Laura working to refine her sense of texture. Hey, we're forming a sophisticated neurological network. One thing that brains do is differentiate texture. Let's isolate that sense, and let's allow the brain to develop into really refining that sense of different textures. Because after all, this is who you really are, right? So if we create an environment that allows us to exercise all aspects of the brain through the hands, through the senses, we're going to build a better brain. How else can we build better brains? Well, we know motivated learning is essential. A Montessori teacher knows that there is something to discover. She or he creates the foundations for that and lets a child make that discovery for themselves. We know that allowing children time to persist on an activity, the 3-hour work cycle where they get uninterrupted opportunity to engage in uninterrupted work, to go deep and to go long on figuring things out. Look at the elation here. By God, she spelled toothpaste, and she knows it. And look at her friend Maura next to her, just about ready to climb into the movable alphabet box, you know? That excitement and engagement won't happen if you say, okay, children, put away your movable alphabets, we're now going to do math. Because they're into it. Why would you want to interrupt that process? Let them finish. Let them get everything there is to get out of that. And if we give them a long, uninterrupted period, they'll go long and they'll go deep. And of course, this is stuff I'm showing you out primary, which is really, that's the aspect of Montessori that I'm most in love with, because that's where I fell in love with Montessori education. But you know, when they get into elementary, when they go beyond, they really discover the big questions. They learn the answer to questions like, what was here before I was here? How did the universe begin? What do we know? And please tell me as straight up as you can, because it's important that they hear the truth of these things, even the truth of what we don't know. You know what? We don't know what was before, but we know a little bit about how it happened, how here happened. These are such burning questions for young children in the elementary years, and Montessori does not disappoint them. It answers these questions. It provides opportunities to engage in more older child versions of experimental interactions with the environment. I mentioned my daughter goes to Hershey Montessori Farm School, where they're doing adolescent versions of experimental interaction with the environment. It's not just Montessori programs that allow this opportunity. Who knows what this is? Yeah, this is SimCity. Who knows what SimCity is? Okay? If you're sitting next to somebody who didn't raise their hand, explain what SimCity is about after the lecture, okay? So this is an urban planning simulation where you get to engage in experimental interactions with the environment around what happens if you don't build fire stations. And after your town burns down, you say, okay, well, this time we'll have a few, okay? And the man who invented SimCity, his name is Will Wright, he created all of these sim games. He created The Sims, the biggest selling computer game in human history. It was created by this man. This man's name is Will Wright. Would you like to hear Will Wright talk about his own Montessori education? We got one who wants to. Anybody else want to hear about that? Okay. Now, I want to note, Will Wright is in traction. He was in an accident. So, Will Wright, he's not a cyborg, he's a game designer. That's right. So, he's going to now talk about his own experience of Montessori education.
And the power that I see inherent in them. When I was a kid, I actually did Montessori school up to 6th grade in Atlanta, Georgia. And at the time, I didn't think much about it, but then later I kind of realized that that was kind of a high point in my education. From that point on, everything else was pretty much downhill. And what I told later is I started making games that I really actually think of them more as toys. People call me a game designer, but I really think of these things more as toys. But I started getting very interested in Marie Montessori and her methods and the kind of way she went about things and the way she thought it very valuable for kids to kind of discover things on their own rather than being taught these things just kind of overtly. And she would design these toys where kids, in playing with the toys, would actually come to understand these deep principles of life and nature through play. And since they discovered those things, it really stuck with them so much more. And also, they would experience their own failures. There was a failure-based aspect to learning there that was very important. And so the games that I do, I think of really more as modern Montessori toys. And I really kind of want them to be presented in a way where kids can kind of explore and discover their own principles.
Man, isn't that beautiful? To explore and discover their own principles. That's what's happening here. Okay, I've been talking for 49 minutes and 43 seconds. How's everybody doing? I'm not done. Is that okay? I want you now to marshal your attention. I want you to reorient yourself for a moment. I want you to come back into the room because, friends, the most interesting part of the talk begins now. So whatever you've been holding in reserve, now is the time to bring it forward because it's going to get really interesting. Are you ready for this? Because now I'm going to talk about something that I find personally rather exciting. I'm going to talk about executive functions. Who's with me? Okay, great. So all that hands-on, direct, kind of discovery-oriented learning supports the development of a set of essential cognitive functions. I've talked about nuggets and networks. I've talked about nuggets and networks, but I will now talk about a set of brain functions that act together as a kind of nuggetized network. In my business, we call these skills executive functions, and you'll be hearing a lot more about them in the next few years as their critical importance becomes more widely recognized in education. I believe that Montessori education provides an environment for children, for young children, for elementary-age children, and for adolescents that is simply unparalleled in creating opportunities for the development of these essential cognitive functions. And I believe there is nothing that equals what Montessori brings to the table. And again, that is motivating some of my own research that I'm doing now. So let's talk about brains again. So there's that picture of that brain I showed you earlier. I want to direct your attention to the leftmost part. There's a circle around the name. This is the prefrontal area. And this is the most exciting part of the brain to me because it is this part of the brain that makes us human. This was the last part that evolved as Homo sapiens appeared on planet Earth. The prefrontal cortex plays an essential role in human nature. In fact, this part of the brain allows us to modify remote events through intentional behavior. What does that mean, to modify remote events through intentional behavior? Events that are remote in time or in space. Indeed, it is the evolution of the prefrontal cortex that allows humans to link the present to the future. And in fact, when this capability evolved, this is so essential that once this mental ability evolved in humans, the evolutionary contest on planet Earth was over and we had won it. Here's our nearest evolutionary neighbor. Here's a chimpanzee. Now, chimpanzees can certainly demonstrate much in the way of problem solving. For example, if there was boxes lying around and there was a bunch of bananas hanging from the ceiling, a chimpanzee can figure out how to stack the boxes to retrieve the banana hanging from the ceiling, okay? And at that moment, the boxes cease to have meaning. Chimpanzees don't know how to save boxes, hoard these resources to use later on, maybe next week, in case bananas reappear, okay? They don't have that capacity to sort of plan for the future in this way. We have more cortex proportional to our body size than chimpanzees do, and we especially have more of this area, the prefrontal cortex. So what do we do with all that brain? What do we do with all that? Well, here is where resides things like judgment, planning, imagining, foresight, organizing ourselves and our materials, awareness of ourselves, correcting ourselves when we're going down the wrong path and solving a new problem, selecting a strategy, monitoring our progress. These are the skills that are essential for effective goal-directed behavior, and this is what we use that part of our brain with. Montessori education, the activities that support the development of this region of the brain are pervasive in Montessori. There is almost nothing a child does in a Montessori environment that is not supporting the development of this region of the brain. This is essential. These are essential functions. It is these executive functions that allow us to be the CEO of ourselves. You understand what I mean by that? This is how we organize ourselves. And there's something important to understand about executive functions. Unlike learning problems like dyslexia, I showed you the dyslexic brain earlier, unlike learning problems, which we know at least a little bit about remediating, it appears that there was almost nothing that we can do to deliberately foster the development of these executive functions. It appears that, and I mean in a remedial sense, we can remediate learning disabilities. We cannot remediate poor development of executive functions. It appears that the amount of these that you've got depends substantially by your genetic endowment and also by your early developmental experiences. Poor executive functions result in poor ability to perform goal-directed behavior. Poor executive functions are what stand between an individual's potential and their ability to reach their potential. These are essential human skills. People who do not have well-developed executive functions are simply not good at doing things. And again, it is here that Montessori education plays what I think is a unique role among educational opportunities. You can develop these skills in other environments. I believe there does not exist an environment, however, that fosters the development of these skills in children to the degree that Montessori does. And how you develop these skills? There it is again, through experimental interactions with the environment. There is no weekend workshop you can go to and come back with a clipboard or a 3-ring notebook that says, here's how to grow executive functions in children. You can't. It simply is through experimental interactions with the environment that we develop these skills. Something else that's remarkable. The term executive functions didn't exist back in Montessori's day. She actually invented a term that means exactly the same thing. She was aware of this. She was aware of this over 100 years ago, and she talked about normalization, which is one of those funny Montessori words. But these are the attributes of normalization that she described as emergent in children who were in these environments. She talked about the capacity for profound concentration, the ability to focus and remain focused, the capacity for spontaneous self-discipline, to correct themselves, to maintain self-control, to work hard on a task and persist at it. She talked about their independence and initiative, their love of order, their love of work. Why did these children love work? Why did they love doing things? I think they love doing things because they're good at doing things. It's rewarding. It's intrinsically rewarding for human beings to engage in productive activity. And you know, if your brain is lined up, if you've got good cognitive control, you're using yourself as a tool in the achievement of goal-directed behavior. So she talked about these aspects of normalization. These are aspects of mature prefrontal cortex. There's not a neuroscientist in the world who wouldn't look at that list and say, oh, I know, these are executive functions. And these are essential human skills. In fact, early development of executive functions is a better predictor of later academic performance than is early development of academic skills. Because of course, you'll use these things as you engage in all learning activities throughout the entire lifespan. And the great thing about Montessori is you're not picking either or, you're getting both. You're getting early development of academic skills while you're developing profound levels of executive functioning. I want to talk a couple of other attributes too. She talked about these children love silence and being alone. They're attached to reality, they're obedient, and they're joyful. And I see these as kind of secondary aspects of it. You can't have these unless you've got the ones above. These children love silence and being alone because they're at home with their own minds. They have orderly minds. They enjoy thinking about things because they're good at it. They're attached to reality. Think about the hands, right? They have spent their developmental years learning the properties of reality. They're very connected to reality. They enjoy being here. And they're obedient. What a funny old-fashioned word that is. No, they do not view the adults in their environment as opponents. They view the adults in their environment as resources. That's the kind of obedience that they've got. And they're joyful. They're joyful because they're good at doing things. And what a joy that is, to look around the world and feel that you are the master of your fate. The things that you want to do, you are capable of doing. That is why they're joyful. And again, there's not a neuroscientist alive who wouldn't look at that list and say, oh, what she's really talking about here is executive functioning. And that is. And that's why you don't know it, but that's the primary outcome that you're getting for your children in a school like this. That's worth every penny and more that you're paying for tuition, because this toolbox, the one that they carry between their ears, is going to be their meal ticket for the rest of their life. And what they've got is a huge jump start. Okay, so let's talk about, we're almost done here. How are we holding out? So far, so good? Okay. Remember early on when I showed you this list of the top 10 educational goals rated very important by students? I won't read it again, but that's the list that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. And here too is the top 10 educational goals rated very important by teachers. I won't read it to you again, you already heard it. But did you happen to notice that nowhere on that list do teachers rank doing well on standardized tests? Do you notice that? It's not in the top 10. You know what? It's not in the top 15. It's not in the top 20. In fact, it is number 23 on the list of things that teachers in traditional education environments think matter. Number 23. Now here's the rest of that research. When asked what goals received the most attention, the teachers noted that helping students do as well as they could on standardized tests received the most attention of everything they do in their classrooms. Helping them develop a considerate attitude towards other people. 63% say that received the most attention. 76% rated the most attention going to helping students do as well as they can on standardized tests. Well, okay, they made a list of goals that they thought were relevant. How successful are they in achieving those teachers? How successful are they in achieving their goals? And the number one goal, by a long shot, that they are most successful in doing is helping students do as well as they can on standardized tests. 83% rated that moderately or very successful. 61% teaching them about what's right and wrong. And let's just shoot to the bottom. Helping them take an interest in and understand what is happening in the world, 43%, at least moderately successful in attaining that goal. Well, friends, there's democracy. How's that working? You know, Maria Montessori said, if education is always to be conceived along the same antiquated lines of a mere transmission of knowledge, there's little to be hoped from it in the bettering of man's future. It kind of resonates, doesn't it? It kind of makes sense. What she's talking about is what school should be for. It should be for helping children get good at doing things. That's what she said education should be for. So let's talk about some things that people do in the world. I can talk to you now about some other research that talked about the kinds of activities that really good senior managers demonstrate, okay? The things that they do that are noticed by their peers. And so if you're a senior manager, if you're in charge of some enterprise, and if you're good at what you're doing, you have a couple of these, not all of these. You've figured out where your specialization lies. You might be really good at showing leadership through initiative. You might be really good at demonstrating leadership by setting goals with your group, or coaching, or influencing people in organizations, or building teams, or listening and demonstrating empathy, controlling impulses, especially the impulse toward annoyance. You might be good at helping others analyze problems and develop strategies. You might be really good at rewarding and recognizing contributions. The fascinating thing is that when senior managers talk about other senior managers and the things that they do that make them superior, really good, they talk about these sorts of things. And everybody has their one or two. Nobody does all of these things. And of course, you may realize that none of these things are learned in business school. Business school gives you necessary but not sufficient information to be a good manager. These things, how do you develop those skills? Is there a weekend workshop? Will they give you a theory notebook that tells you how to be a good manager? Well, they'll give you some information about it, but how do you develop the skills to build teams, to listen and demonstrate empathy, to help others, to show initiative, to set goals? Well, maybe it's going to happen in a Montessori environment where you plant things, and then you harvest them, and then you process them, and then you package your product. And then you learn that it turns out that if we wrap this little raffia around it, that we sell 20% more jars of pumpkin butter at the farmer's market. And God help you, if you think that this exercise is about the pumpkin butter, you simply haven't been paying attention. What are the things that you learn through this process? How would that help you in your career? Would you learn those things in a business school? Would you learn about raw materials, about processing, about packaging, about producing and selling? This is the kids in a Montessori program in Austin, Texas. What are they learning that they'll never forget by this experience? We know that competent machine operators, for example, when we ask machine operators to nominate exceptional machine operators, they talk about these sorts of things: dependability, accuracy, being able to respond to the needs of the situation without needing instructions, getting along with others, taking responsibility. And of course, none of this you learn in vocational school. Vocational school provides necessary but not sufficient skills to be exceptional even at a job like this. And so where will you learn these things? Well, it might be in a school where you get to do a hands-on work, where you get to design. If you think it's about the chicken coop, you're simply not paying attention. It's about hands-on engagement and problem-solving activity. It's organizing, planning, budgeting, getting an adult to take you to the lumberyard, coming back, realizing you forgot the 2x4s, getting another adult to take you back to the lumberyard. Because after all, doesn't all meaningful learning take place through analysis of error? So what if you had opportunities to do this? And you got to learn about things like math as part of measuring and estimating and things like that. It's applied. It's not the only thing that you do. But what an important thing to be able to engage in experimental interactions with the environment, to use those giant hands that feed the brain in figuring out how the world works. Now, some of you will have a question such as this one. That's all very fine, Dr. Hughes, but how do Montessori kids turn out compared to those who attend traditional schools? Well, they turn out very well, and we know something about that. This is an article published in the journal Science, which I'm sure you've heard of by Angeline Lillard. And this got published in Science because she actually had randomized assignment to Montessori versus non-Montessori because the kids get into Craig Montessori School via lottery in Milwaukee because more of them want to go there than can get in there. This is a public school in Milwaukee, Craig Montessori. And she was able to compare those who won the lottery and got to go to Craig with those who lost the lottery and went to other schools, some suburban schools, some public urban schools, even some charter and voucher schools. And Lillard was able to compare these two very similar groups and see what their outcomes were across a wide range of outcomes. So she looked at social cognition. And I don't have time to describe the whole procedure to you, but the Montessori kids were better at putting themselves into other people's shoes and seeing a situation from another person's perspective, significantly better at that. Social problem solving. She asked them to respond to a series of vignettes that were like little social conflicts. So here's an example. Kathy's been on the swing a long time and Lori really wants to swing. So what could Lori do or say so she could have the swing? What else could she do or say? What would you do? And so as you might imagine, the kind of responses that children make, in a study like this, you can kind of code the responses. So please, can I swing on this swing? Okay, that's positive, it's assertive, and it's polite. Okay, that's a nice response. The child could suggest that each have a minute. That would be fair. Okay, positive, assertive, and an appeal to social justice or fairness. You could say, I'll be your friend if I can have a turn. Okay, less positive. You could just wait. Just waiting is passive. You could tell her dad to spank her. Okay, well, that's negative and it's an appeal to authority. And so what you find is that when you sort of total up how the kids who were randomly chosen for the Montessori environment compared to the kids who randomly had a traditional education environment, you see some interesting things. The Montessori kids do not play the friendship card. They do play the justice card dramatically more. In other words, when they're resolving social conflicts, they say, what would be most fair? What would be most fair for everyone? They also looked at interpersonal behavior. So one of the things you can do is you can rate behavior on the playground to see how they are with each other when there's no adults around. They're not in the classroom. They're out at recess. And so there's something that you see young children do sometimes. You've seen it. They're kind of playing. They're laughing. They're crying. It looks kind of rough. I'm not sure if they're enjoying themselves. They're not. You're not sure if they know if they're enjoying themselves. You know what I'm saying? A little rough and tumble, laughing, maybe crying, can't tell what's going on here. There's a term for that, and you'll love it. It's called ambiguous rough play. It says it all, doesn't it? So when they rated the playground behavior of the Montessori kids and the kids in the traditional schools, what you found was that there was significantly more positive shared play among the Montessori kids, almost no ambiguous rough play among the Montessori kids, and also there was less of the kid out drifting on their own kind of play. You know what I'm saying? They were engaged in positive interaction with peers, and they were nice to each other. I've talked about executive functioning, and if you can believe it, you can actually measure some aspects of that, even in young children. And I can't describe the task to you now, but the Montessori kids in kindergarten, in their kindergarten year, showed significantly stronger executive functions, just like we're talking about, what a critical thing that is in brain development that contributes to their performance for the rest of their lives. They were already showing an advantage at the end of the kindergarten year. So Lillard found by the end of kindergarten, the Montessori kids randomly assigned to condition had superior executive control, superior decoding and early math skills. See, they got the early academic stuff too, right? And while they got it, they were developing their executive skills. They had better social awareness, they made more appeals to justice and fairness, and they had better social behavior. Then she looked at a cohort that was in their 6th grade year. And it will comfort you to know that the kids in the traditional education environment also learned things, okay? They also learned things, and so that early kind of academic advantage for the Montessori kids, that sort of evened out. Other kids learned how to do math and read as well. The Montessori kids had these things earlier, but the other kids also developed them by 6th grade. But what the Montessori kids still had was superior social skills, a superior sense of being part of a community, and they showed greater creativity in stories that they wrote, and they used more complexity in the sentences that they wrote. So they actually had a more artful use of language. Probably because they've been writing sentences since they were 4 and a half, using the movable alphabet, They've been actually doing writing for years longer than their peers. Here's another outcome. This is from East Dallas Community School in East Dallas, Texas. This is a Montessori program that serves children ages birth to 3rd grade. This program ends in 3rd grade. You follow me? In 2002, and this just happens to be the year that was written about, but in 2002, almost 80% of those graduating 3rd graders applied for gifted and talented programming in the Dallas Independent School District. Almost 80% applied for gifted and talented services, and all were accepted. These are kids who sadly live in the wrong part of town, okay? I hate to say it that way, but that sort of is how it is. These are kids living in a rough part of town. These are kids growing up in poverty. All were accepted to gifted and talented programming. And this is a community where less than 50% of students typically graduate from high school. It kind of tells you a lot about the community, doesn't it? But since 1978, 97% of the kids who attend East Dallas Community School graduate high school or earn a GED. And the vast majority of them graduate with a regular diploma, like maybe 3 or 4% do the GED thing, okay? The vast majority complete a 12-year high school diploma. But we're not done yet, because almost 90% of them have gone on to college. That was reported in the Dallas Morning News. Just savor that for a moment. How many lives? How many lives saved? How many families turning out because of their opportunity for a Montessori program just through 3rd grade? That's all it took. I'm very enthusiastic about Montessori education, as you might have noticed. And I can't help but, but reflect for a moment on how traditional education is doing right now in our country. Traditional education, teacher, student, test, right? That's what defines traditional education. I call that school 1.0, teacher, student, test. So like Montessori, it hasn't changed a lot in the past 100 years. It still looks pretty much like that. And in recent years, we see headlines like this all the time. Hundreds more public schools fall short. The list of public schools failing to meet No Child Left Behind standards rose from 483 to 729 this year. That was in my hometown newspaper. Schools struggle to hit state marks. Who remembers this headline? 6-year-old stares down bottomless abyss of formal schooling. Okay, it's from The Onion. But it's funny because it's true. You know what I mean? It's kind of funny because it's kind of true. I think that it is time to recognize that School 1.0 has sort of run out of time. It's not getting better. And in fact, the emphasis that we have on standardized testing and improving standardized test scores, all that has served to do is to narrow the scope of what is acceptable to do in school, to narrow it to that which causes increases on standardized test scores. Art, physical education, band, choir, all of these subjects, which are inherently developmental in nature, are secondary to doing more teaching to the test. This emphasis on scores in School 1.0 simply narrows the scope of what is relevant behavior in schools. It's time to consider something different. I think Montessori education represents a model that we should call School 2.0, which recognizes that, well, what I've been saying here, that school should be about building better brains for children. It should be about maximizing their developmental capabilities. Teacher-student test has nothing for that. School 2.0, let's call it explore, engage, integrate. That's what happens here. That's what's good for children's brains. And these are the things that make it happen. There's this beautiful culture that respects children, and respects children in a way that really is hard to fully grasp unless you're around it. And there's this method that recognizes that we do the most concrete to the most abstract. We move every brain along as it's ready. There's always some new, slightly more abstract material to master. This repetition of mastery, mastery on a new activity at a higher developmental level, and then mastery at another activity at a higher developmental level, using these magnificent materials. In my view, these are the components that make a strong Montessori environment. And I fell in love with the materials because they made sense to me as a pediatric neuropsychologist. But in my final words today, I want to talk about this incredible Montessori culture. I believe that at its core, Montessori education represents a kind of cultural intervention in the lives of children and their families. It's an exposure to a view of childhood, a view of humanity that I think is simply transforming. In my career as a pediatric neuropsychologist, I've met many hundreds of children and their families, most of them in some kind of crisis, many of them disturbed or disappointed by the experiences they've had in schools, many of them stressed or threatened by illness. And I've seen personally, and this is certainly confirmed in research, that the social milieu, the environment that surrounds a family and a child, not only influences their thoughts about themselves and other people and their future, but also actually impacts their ability to recover from or survive trauma or life-threatening disease. Who you mix with matters. Specifically, who your children mix with matters. Because as we all know, human beings are shaped by their social experiences. We learn how to be human beings from other human beings. Children take what is given them by the adults in their world, and then they convey these experiences to those around them. Montessori environments are not just about the development of executive functions, social awareness, and academic skills. They provide exposure to a culture that is deeply supportive of those things that we identify with civilization. And if you're a student of history, civilization is optional. When almost 100 years ago, Marie Montessori wrote, "Whoever touches the life of the child touches the most sensitive point of a whole, which has roots in the most distant past and climbs toward the infinite future." She was talking about civilization. At this point in the history of our world, of our civilization, what happens next? depends upon how the earth and its inhabitants are regarded by those who stand to inherit it. I believe that if our children and grandchildren are to see the 22nd century, those who are running things during the rest of the 21st century must value a culture, a civilization that holds peace, kindness, fairness, and respect for the needs and well-being of others as core values. And these values lay at the heart of Montessori education, and I believe they will support the survival of our planet and our species. All of us know this picture. It was taken in July of 1972 by the crew of Apollo 17. It was this picture that was called the defining image of the 20th century. From this picture came the phrase Spaceship Earth, and it showed us so vividly, and really for the first time, that all of us on this planet are in it together. Now here's another space picture. Now this image really should be the defining image of the 21st century. It was taken on September 15, 2006 by the NASA space probe Cassini when it was past the orbit of Saturn. And why should this be the defining image of the 21st century? Well, this obviously is Saturn. And this, that's us. That's us. Now this image reminds us that we are alone. We're alone. There is no Starship Enterprise. Physics is real. There is no access to an advanced external intelligence that's going to save us. There's no governmental agency. There's no last remaining superpower that is going to get on board and solve the problems that threaten the survival of our planet and our species. It really is up to us, and really at this point up to our children, and if there are to be any, their children. Never before in the history of our planet have we so badly needed children that know how to play nice, that respect others, that love the earth, that value justice, and are attached to reality. Montessori education is now just over 100 years old. And Maria Montessori came not a moment too soon, because it has never been more important for us to produce children who can look around, figure out what needs to be done, and do it. We have never before so needed a generation of children that was good at doing things. And that's why I am a supporter of Montessori education, and that's why I'm here tonight. Thank you all for listening.